you on behalf of the German Federal Culture Foundation. The foundation focuses its funding on contemporary culture and international cultural exchange. Right from the start of our activities, an important goal has been the support of museums, memorial sites, and congresses dedicated to the commemoration of anti-Semitic and racist violence. I want to point out that this goal is today more important than ever. We live in a time in which we are alarmed by the growth of anti-Semitic and racism, but also of the aggressive contempt for democracy and human rights. We need to stand up against it. Culture of remembrance, Erinnerungskultur, is a very special and a very German word and concept. For many years, this concept was at the heart of a fierce public debate regarding the interpretation of Germany's past. For our responsibility for the Shoah and the Shoah's uniqueness in the European and world history. In recent times, Germany's responsibilities for colonial atrocities have also become part of intense controversies in this country. This shift adds to a new dimension to our memory culture, a difficult one as well. It's quite obvious we need to talk. We need to debate about a question that Michael Rothberg has described as a major political challenge, and I would like to quote his remark as follows. How is it possible to remember the specificities of one's own history without silencing those of another? End of the quote. In our very diverse societies, we need to ask whether all these different histories are related, and in what way are they related? And how can we create a space in which different approaches to history may stand side by side, each on its own right or intertwined with each other, but without being reduced to examples of one abstract history of violence? This is what we want to talk about today, and I'm very happy that we can start this series with two highly distinguished guests. It's my pleasure, but it's also my honor to introduce you to Carolin Emcke and Michael Rothberg. Carolin Emcke is a philosopher and writer. She has published widely on issues as theories of violence, interconnections between trauma and silence, as well as the impacts of historical witnessing. I would like to name one of her many books, Weil es sagbar ist, Because We Can Speak. Here she reflects on historical witnessing and the politics of memory. Michael Rothberg is the 1939 Society Samuel Goetz Chair in Holocaust Studies and Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Los Angeles. He has published numerous books. His publication, Multidirectional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization, is of very special interest for us today. It will be, by the way, released in German in a couple of weeks. So, thank you for being our guests in this first edition of Labore des Zusammenlebens. You are invited to ask questions. Please send them to us per chat. We look forward to your talk. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Hortensia Völkers, for the introduction. Welcome everyone who's watching and listening to us. Welcome to Michael. It's a great honor and joy to be able to talk to you about the questions of memory and trauma, the questions of empathy and solidarity with regard to different forms of racial or genocidal violence. Your book, Hortensia has just mentioned it, Multidirectional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization, will now be published in German. I think it's 12 years after its original edition. And the book, for those who don't know the book yet, I would like to say it's incredibly rich in references. It's creative, it's original in analysis, it's multidirectional in itself. You refer to art, to films, documentaries, all fiction, to literature, to philosophical theory, to psychoanalysis. So there's endless ways in which to present this book. But I would like to begin our conversation today by asking you, how did you, as a historian of the Shoah, begin by thinking, or how did you get to think about multidirectional memory at all? What got you the idea?
Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah. Well, first of all, just let me thank you, Carolin and Emcke, for joining this event today and being part of it. It's really an honor for me as well. And I'm grateful to you, and I'm grateful to Hortensia Volkers and the Kulturstiftung for hosting this event. It's really very exciting for me, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to talk to you all, especially on the eve of the publication of Multidirectional Memory in Germany. I hope that multidirectional memory will be of interest to a German public. I look forward to the discussions, but I have to say that, of course, I didn't write it for a German audience. It wasn't written for a German public, and it wasn't written recently. It was published 12 years ago, as you said, Carolin. And I started work on it about 20 years ago, which is kind of unbelievable to me, but it's actually true. The first chapters of it were written about 20 years ago. So I think it still has relevance to the present. I hope, again, that it still has relevance to the present, but of course it comes out of a somewhat different context and a different moment, I suppose, in my own life. I had written a dissertation in comparative literature on the representation of the Holocaust. It was published as a book called Traumatic Realism, and it really was focused very much on the Holocaust specifically. Again, approached from different angles, from more philosophical angles. There are chapters on Adorno and Maurice Blanchot. There are chapters on testimony about Ruth Kluger and Charlotte Delbo, two writers who've been very important to me in my thinking. And there's approaches to popular culture and novels and films and museums and that sort of thing. While I was working on that, I had what I thought was a kind of parallel interest in post-colonial studies and in Black diaspora cultures. And these were fields that were, post-colonial study was sort of emerging as I was in graduate school, coming to prominence in the United States at that time. Again, back some years. Black cultures, African-American and diaspora cultures, of course, have a much longer resonance in the US, but my interest was developing around that same time. And I guess for a long time, I thought of these as separate interests, right? On the one hand, I was interested in the Holocaust. On the other hand, I was interested in these questions that were coming out of post-colonial theory. And I was interested in African-American writers like Toni Morrison. Mm-hmm. But at a certain moment, I started to realize that maybe these were not separate, right? These were not separate interests, but interests that actually had certain kinds of points of contact that came into contact that crossed each other in ways. And, you know, I started to think about the importance of memory, not just in Jewish cultures and histories, but also in Black cultures. The importance of testimony, thinking about slave narratives in relationship to Holocaust testimonies, right? So I started to see thematic connections. And there was a book published in, I believe it was 1993, by Paul Gilroy. This was when I was in graduate school, called The Black Atlantic. And that had an enormous impact on me. It was primarily an attempt to take the study of Black cultures out of a national framework and to consider a diasporic reach, right? To consider Black culture in a diasporic context with the Middle Passage as a kind of traumatic origin, right, for diasporic Black cultures, and really for modernity itself in Gilroy's reading. And that itself was already a huge, huge argument, a hugely influential one, sometimes controversial, but important. But what especially appealed to me was the final chapter, where he did a kind of initial work of bringing together, again, Black cultures and Jewish cultures around some of these themes that I've just been talking about, in particular around the theme of memory. And so he juxtaposes in that final chapter, as I remember it, it's been a while since I actually went back to it, Primo Levi and Toni Morrison talking about memory. And, you know, when I read that, it just sort of kind of light bulb went off, where I said, wait a second, you can do this. You can bring these things together. It's possible, right? And it's somehow been authorized by this, you know, important, prominent scholar in this very important book. So that kind of, in some ways, that was the first moment where
somehow allowed you to even think something that was unthinkable to you before and seemed to be totally disconnected. Would that be a way to frame it?
Yes, it was a kind of gave us sort of permission, I suppose. And, you know, similar things were happening from the side of Jewish studies as well. I was also very struck and influenced by the work of Jonathan Boyarin, a very prominent scholar in Jewish studies today, at the time already quite prolific, but still quite junior in a sense. A book called Storm from Paradise, with a kind of Benjaminian reference, where he was talking about the relationship between Jewish studies and post-colonial studies, and sort of the question of how do we relate the other without, the colonial other, and the other within, the Jewish other within Europe. And that, again, was a sort of initial moment that sparked interest, sparked my interest, and gave a kind of permission, as you say, to take up these questions.
I want to be careful in this conversation and not jump to shortcuts, but I want to really go sort of slow motion through the various philosophical frames, so to speak, of this concept. And I would say multidirectional memory appears in at least 3 different configurations or roles in your book, and I would like to distinguish them and you know, discuss them one after the other. The first form or configuration of multidirectional memory is with regard to actual individual or collective remembering an experience one has survived. So as a witness in the sense of superstis, something one has lived, you know, an experience one has lived through and speaks about afterwards. The second kind or role of multidirectional memory is referring to thinking about historical interconnectedness, sort of systematic relationships between different forms of violence. So it's not the memory itself that is related, but the question of the actual racial or genocidal violence. How are they or might they be connected? And what does it mean to realize connections? So this form, the second form of comparative multidirectional analysis, seems to invite misunderstanding or abuse because it is connected to the question of singularity or the denial of singularity of the Shoah and the effects of such claims. And the third type or role or configuration of multidirectional memory is referring to the politics of memory, to the public or institutional historical reflection that seeks to acknowledge an experience or crime. And so everyone who's watching, please be patient. I want to try to go through these different aspects because they're all incredibly rich in the book. They're all extremely important, but they seem to discuss slightly different questions. So if we begin with the first, if we take memory to mean, in the most fundamental sense, to make present often experience, then memory always already has a dual temporality. It has sort of the material of the past, and it is somehow reconstructed, recreated, displaced, repressed, or triggered in the present. Could you explain how you understand this multidirectional memory to actually work?
Yeah, okay, thanks. That's a really beautiful way of kind of laying out the issues, I think. And yeah, let's try to take them
okay.
one, if we can. And I think, I think what you said there at the end is really the key for me for why memory interests me and what is specific about memory and how you get from the question of memory to the question of multidirectionality. And one of the arguments of the book is indeed that is a structural argument about memory itself.
Exactly.
Right? So
yeah.
even before we get to the question of the Holocaust, though, as I say in the book, and I'll say again, I don't think the question of the Holocaust is arbitrary in any way in this conversation, but I do feel like in the process of writing this book, I discovered something, at least for myself, about memory as such.
Yeah.
Which is that memory is structurally, in my words, multidirectional. And I think that, and this was not what I set out to do, this was not, it took a long time to even, for me to figure out that the core term of the book was memory in some ways. It was started out about the Holocaust, it was about decolonization, there were so many different angles that I considered before finally realizing, yeah, no, this is actually a book about memory. And I do think for me, it is precisely that kind of constellation between the past and the present, which is definitive of memory, and which is ultimately gives it the kind of multi-directional logic that I see in it. So I guess I would put it this way, which is that, of course, personal experiences are always specific, right? They're always located in a particular space and in a particular time. But when we remember them, we always remember them from somewhere else, right? We always remember them from certainly from a different time, right? It's always, memory always is going to have that retrospective dimension to it. But the place from which we remember is also transformed in the meantime, right? As we move through time, I suppose, as we move historically. So memory always creates a kind of short circuit between two different spaces and two different times, it seems to me. The difference of the moment of remembrance, I think, always influences what is remembered, right? In other words, we don't bring back a pure, untainted representation of the original experience. We bring it back in a particular moment, in a new context, amidst new frameworks, right? So I know we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but it makes a difference whether we're remembering the Holocaust, right, in 1950s West Germany or East Germany, or France, right? Or the United States, or Israel, or where have you. And in that process of remembrance then, in these different places, in these different times, inevitably, it seemed to me, different events are going to start to intersect and influence the memory. And so, I mean, I don't know if that helps to get us started.
No, that's fine. Can you, I'm interested in how these intersections actually work. How can we imagine that memory is, memory of a certain time can only be, or is sometimes only, touched and re-invoked and reignited by thinking about a completely different time. That is what the multi-directionality actually refers to. And And so maybe you could give an example from the book, the figure of Marceline in the film that you describe, how the one memory is only possible to be addressed within a context that actually wants to talk about a totally different experience. Maybe you could give the audience such an example.
Yeah, sure. And you use the word trigger, and I think that's a useful word for thinking about what we're talking about here. And actually, before I get to the book, just an example that occurred that I read about yesterday, in a sense, and it's maybe a very actual one, I suppose, which is there was an article in the Washington Post about Holocaust survivors in Israel and their travails during the COVID-19 crisis, during the pandemic. And the way that for a lot of survivors, it would seem, according to this article, the isolation of that the pandemic has created has in some ways triggered memories of camps and ghettos for them. Now, for people like that, obviously, I don't think they need triggers to remember those things. I'm sure it's always present, but you can see how an event which has absolutely nothing to do with the Holocaust, of course, starts to trigger those kinds of memories and starts to create constellations that are not historically grounded, but are experientially rich and powerful.
It's an interesting example. It's actually even better than the one that I was thinking of, because in the book you also refer to Walter Benjamin's text über den Begriff der Geschichte, and there's I don't know how the English quote is, but the German quote starts with: Zum Denken gehört nicht nur die Bewegung der Gedanken, sondern ebenso ihre Stilllegung. In English, it continues something like, where thinking suddenly stops in a constellation, pregnant with tensions, it gives that constellation a shock by which it crystallizes into a monad. And that is something I would like you to elaborate a little bit. Is that what happens in such a moment, that we sometimes are confronted in the present with just an image, a sound, a smell, a topography, or we witness a certain form of violence and exclusion, and it re-invokes the memory of another? Could you elaborate on that? Is that what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways that is the classic understanding we have of memory, and it comes from Proust, right? I mean, the first thing I thought of when you described it that way, especially the sense-based nature of the memory, right? The Madeleine dunked in tea, which opens up this past world. So I do think in an individual level, it's that kind of, there are these kinds of triggers that are very personal, but can also be kind of arbitrary. And when we get into the social and political realm, leave behind the strictly personal realm that Proust is talking about, then it starts to become, those shocks can be very pregnant with social and political meaning. So I guess I'm thinking also of the work of Charlotte Delbo.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking here, I mean, of her work overall and how she came to publish it and some of the resonances that you find in her work. But I'm also thinking of a couple of specific stories that she tells about survivors in the third volume of her Auschwitz and After trilogy. In English, it's called The Measure of Our Days. And it's sort of
German, it's Maß unserer Dinge. I have it here, actually.
Oh, what lovely. So Auschwitz et après. I'm getting it tangled up in the different languages, but Auschwitz und danach, glaube ich. In any case, so it's a series of monologues from the perspective of different survivors of the camps, mostly non-Jewish, but some of them Jewish as well. And there are a couple of instances where people talk about, this was based on interviews that I think she did in the 60s and early 70s, and some interviews with survivors where they're talking about watching the television news and seeing the violence of the Algerian War, for example, or the Vietnam War for that matter, and how this brings back a kind of overwhelming traumatic repetition of their experiences in the camps. And I think that's, sort of common for survivors of traumatic experiences, that, again, things that aren't necessarily historically connected to them, but have some sort of evocative similarities or components, can trigger these kinds of memories. And now I think that's one thing on an individual level, but I think what especially interests me in my work is the public dimension of memory. So, we can't argue with people's personal memories, I think, and one has one's own experiences, of course, but once these start to be articulated publicly, we start to see some of the important constellations through which different memories have been triggered, reshaped, reemerged, this sort of thing. So I guess I would make it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it does not only apply this concept of multidirectional memory to, as you say, people who've experienced a traumatic, violent experience, but once it is in the public domain, once it is part of public discourse, it could also inscribe itself into those of the next generation. If I give an example, maybe from the European context that I could think of, where I knew that something struck me at the moment, but I could not quite, I could not quite name it. But the political consequences were so obvious that I thought, well, somebody else must have had the same effect, reaction. And that was the internment camp Trnje, where in 1992, Bosnian Serb military and police administration imprisoned, 4,000 to 7,000 Bosniaks and Bosnian Croats. And you saw the images because some Western media team filmed this camp. And I don't know if you remember, if you also remember, you could see these bodies, and it was a very particular context. It had a very particular history. It wasn't the present time. It was not the Shoah, and yet I think the shock moment in the Benjamin sense crystallized at that moment. And I think the political response to it was not, just to the camp, but it was also to the memory of other camps. And to add maybe a second example, but also in the same context, I remember 1992 when the Kosovo Albanians were deported and driven out of Kosovo, and they fled in thousands southwards towards Albania and Macedonia. It was a dual temporality that one witnessed at the moment, and I think it triggered not just, evidently that's not my memory. I could not have the memory of the 30s or the 40s, but so there is a multidirectional memory at stake also with regard to sort of public memory.
Yeah, absolutely. And to speak a little bit autobiographically again, that was that same moment that was so important for me. I think we're about the same age, and it was in that sort of around 1993 is the year for me that sticks out for reasons I'll mention in a moment, when it was precisely the war in the former Yugoslavia, and then the following year the Rwandan genocide, that really triggered something for me. And that was the moment when I was writing this first book, Traumatic Realism, writing my dissertation, again, on the Holocaust specifically, but things were happening around the world, which again, were not the same, of course, but which couldn't help but remind you of those other events. And so I started to wonder, can I really just talk about the Holocaust when things that are, I think, analogous at the very least are happening again. And it was also a moment, you remember, in the aftermath of, in the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, when a little bit like the last few years, there was a kind of reinvigorated neo-Nazi movement, right? There were gravesite desecrations in France. There were the fire bombings of asylum buildings and of immigrant houses in Germany, right? That a lot of us were, very concerned about. And so there were things happening at that very moment. And so it took me a while then to sort of follow the trail of that. But I think it's inevitably, I think those moments of public consciousness are, again, inevitably multi-directional. And again, that to me, that doesn't mean that we're really saying that the Holocaust is the same as what happened in Bosnia or what happened in Rwanda or Rostock or Hoyerswerda or what have you, right? But
no, sorry.
Yeah, no, but I mean, but I think you also, as citizens, as thinking people, as feeling people, we can't help but start to feel some of those resonances.
And I think that is why it was so important for me to separate these questions, to first speak about memory, because maybe very similar to what you were describing, for me, Kosovo was the first war that I covered, and it was the moment of seeing these images was the moment of deciding I want to go. And it had nothing to do with saying this is the same but what is, I think, the pain and the sorrow and the shame. I mean, there's a whole affective, there's a whole affective psychological web that is touched in such a moment without making any analytical or normative judgment. I think that seems to be something that is to you very important, and that for me is important to separate in this discussion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, to me, there's a kind of, you called it affective. I think that's right. I would also call it a kind of ethical call, right? I think at those moments we find ourselves addressed by these images, by these events, and there's a kind of ethical call. And to me, I mean, Holocaust memory, since it became a prominent force in the world, right, has always come with an ethical imperative, right? A never again, a never forget, that can be taken in lots of different directions and has its problems, to be sure. But there is a kind of intrinsic ethics to it, and a kind of affective power. And so, yeah, I'm in complete agreement.
I have one more question to this, relating to these questions, and then I would like to move on to the second. And that is, the book is so full of examples from literature, from art, from films, that at some point I wondered, is this a historian who actually thinks that literature or art or poetry or film are more adequate forms of historical reflection because they allow in such a creative way for memory to really work in that multi-directional way?
Yeah, actually, I have to correct you on one thing. I really don't see myself as a historian at all.
Okay. Okay, so that explains.
Yeah, so I'm trained as a literary critic. I studied English and linguistics as an undergraduate. I studied comparative literature as a graduate student. So I think in some ways it's more I'm a literary critic who came to see history as essential, but who also came to see cultural texts as providing us access to events in ways that are very powerful, and sometimes even more powerful than, let's say, more traditional documents. And I think especially when we get into the realm of memory, right, and tracking memories, I think that it's often, it is in films, it is in novels, it's in memoirs and testimonies that we get some sort of access to history that maybe that provides us a different view than a traditional approach would. And also, and I think this is really important, to one of the key examples in my book, October 17th, 1961, the massacre in Paris of Algerian demonstrators. I'm sure we'll come back to that, but there is an event which it took decades for historians to approach historically. But by that point, there were already, a novel that had been written, films that had been made, activists who had mobilized the memory of these events. So in some sense, the memory of the events came before the history of the events. And I think that's important, right? So that the dynamic is, again, also kind of multi-directional in a certain sense. It's not a linear development of knowledge of different histories. These emerge in different constellations and coming from different places.
Now, in a pluralistic society, these memories, in that sense that we're talking about them, may overlap. They may contradict. They may challenge each other. The idea that one could limit memory to just one violent experience seems to ignore the pluralism of our societies, and it seems to ignore the plurality of experiences of pain and trauma. Would you say that within I don't know, within your book, I was a bit surprised how prominent the French examples were. And I wondered, if you thought that in France, you could detect this overlapping pluralism of different group memories and different references to different racial or genocidal violence particularly well. Was that a reason?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's one of those things that developed sort of contingently and accidentally as I was working on the book. No, honestly, I didn't know that was going to happen. I didn't plan for that. That's not the way I work, I suppose, in such a systematic way. It's partly accidental. I started, in fact, with W.E.B. Du Bois, right, from the African-American context and his visit to Warsaw. Happy to talk more about that as well, because I think it's a really important and fascinating example. But at a certain moment, I discovered, and it really was accidental, the context of Algerian War era France. And I came to realize that this was, I think as a phrase I use in the book, a kind of laboratory of multi-directional memory. And why might that be so? I don't think France is unique in that way, but I do think it is very rich for exploration. So a couple of things that were going on there, I came to realize, and again, it's sort of obvious once you see it, but it took me a while to get to it, and I don't think a lot of other people had been thinking in those terms either. The wars of decolonization that were fought in France, or fought by France rather, first in Vietnam, but especially in Algeria, followed so quickly on the Nazi occupation and the Holocaust, right? And so the people who were actively involved, let's say, in resisting the war from the French side, were people who 15 years earlier might have been in the resistance of France, or might have been collaborators.
Like Papon.
Like Papon. So what I discovered was, and again, this was not something I knew in advance, there were very real material connections. That kind of gets to the second level there that you laid out earlier. There were very material connections between what had happened in the Nazi period or under Nazi occupation in France, and then what was happening 10, 15 years later in France itself, as it was going through this period of decolonization, these wars of decolonization. And a lot of the personnel was somewhat continuous, and really on both sides of the struggle that were going on. On the one hand, perpetrators like Papon. So Maurice Papon was a police chief who was responsible for the deportation of Jews, including Jewish children, during the occupation.
Which wasn't really known at the time when the massacre took place, one should say that. Yeah.
Correct. So this what he had. We didn't find this out until later, at least publicly speaking. But it came about. We learned later that he was a Vichy police chief who was deporting Jews, and then went on to a glorious career, first as a police chief in Algeria, and then in Paris, where he oversaw a massacre that took place in 1961, late in the Algerian War, of peacefully demonstrating Algerian protesters. And that event made some waves at the time and then also sort of disappeared from view. And it was only much later when people realized what he had done under the Nazis and wanted to bring him to justice, that these two events sort of came together, right? In other words, his responsibility for deportations under the occupation entered the same frame, as it were, entered the same conversation, as it were, with his deeds as a police officer in colonial and then decolonizing France.
Now we're already at the exactly right at the second level of multidirectional memory. This is sort of the second thread, and clearly the one that's much more controversial than the first one. So it is about a comparative multidirectional approach that links different not memories, but historical phenomena themselves. And here my first question would be, what does it mean to search for interconnectedness between different forms of violence or crimes against humanity? What does it actually mean to search for these links?
Yeah, I mean, a great question. And again, I'm not a historian, and so the greater part of my book is not.
Don't chicken out now.
No, I'm not trying to evade the question. No, I'm not trying to evade the question. Just to say that really the primary concern of the book is about how events are remembered. Yeah. And so that's a little bit of different. I mean, that has a history too, and that is partly what I'm tracking in the book. So it is a historical book, I do believe in some ways. But that is a different question than this sort of what I would call connective histories, right? How are histories not only comparative, which I'm certainly interested in myself, but also materially connected.
Yes.
And I do think that Papin, and I didn't search out Papin. And in fact, again, Papin happened to me in a certain sense, right? I became aware that there was this what I would call a kind of multi-directional node, a kind of knot that connected what had happened in 1961 France with 1940s France, that brought together these two histories of violence. So I didn't so much search it out as it came, and I don't know that anyone else searched it out either. I think it sort of arose, it came to consciousness at a certain moment that people realized, wait a second, here's a perpetrator who went from X to Y and took part in both of these things. And I think you can trace that also internal to Nazi genocide. If you look, for example, at people who are involved first in the Tafir program, right, the euthanasia program, and then were sent from there to the camps, right?
Yeah, but it seems, that is one continuity, so to speak, which is sort of a personal continuity. You can see the same individuals, within one context of violence, and actually also in another context of violence. Now, there's another way of searching for connections or searching for similarities, and that is searching for ideological connections, or searching for operational similarities, in the sense of, could you find a way in which colonial violence used space as a way of separating people from each other, and something that you mentioned, this wonderful text by Du Bois on the Warsaw Ghetto, where he does think about the connections of very different forms of, racism or racial logic, or a racialized topography of separation, and yet doesn't seem to normatively, equate them or mistake one for another. So could you elaborate a little bit on that, on what does it mean to search for ideological, operational similarities, and what's the risk?
Sure. Yeah. No. I agree with you completely. The Papon case, and even the case of, say, perpetrators within the Nazi program, sort of moving from one genocide to another, if you will, or from one form of violence to another. That's in some ways a very particular case, and there are other dimensions to this question that are probably even more important, because those are somewhat unusual. A case like Papon is very unusual, right? To discover that was kind of amazing for my book, because it was like, here's a single figure who is himself multi-directional, but that's not the main thing that we're talking about here. I guess what I describe in the book, and what was happening around the same time I was writing this book, again, a book really about the memory of the Holocaust, was that there was what I came to call a colonial turn in Holocaust studies going on, kind of parallel to what I was doing. And I discussed this, fairly briefly, but I think significantly in the book as well. And I'm thinking of the work of someone who I think is well known in Germany, someone like Jürgen Zimmerer, right, who had worked on the genocide in Southwest Africa, in current Namibia, or the American historian of Germany, Isabel Hull, who wrote a book called Absolute Destruction. And what they're doing, I think, is to sort of ask about the preconditions of Nazi genocide, and to argue that, and they're not alone, there are other people, Dirk Moses and many others at this point, ask about the preconditions of Nazi genocide, and to suggest that among the preconditions, right, is a history of colonialism and a history of colonial violence, or in Hull's case, really more a history of the military, because that's more her angle, is to think about particular structures within the German military, and how those were transferred first to Africa and then back to Europe in the Holocaust. But I think that's this search that for connections that you're describing, is, for me at least, and again, it can be done in lots of different ways. It can be done well, it can be done badly, it can be done ways in which that we'd want to criticize harshly, of course, right? This is a discussion, it's an ongoing discussion. But for me, what's most valuable is to think about, what are the conditions of possibility that make genocide imaginable, thinkable, and make it possible to put it into practice, so to speak. And I think one of them is what you already evoked, which is clearly very important, which is this link between race and space, which is certainly central to what Zimmerer is talking about. It comes up in that Du Bois essay that you mentioned, but again, not from a strictly history. He's not writing it as a historian at that moment in any case. But there is certainly, I think it's now quite common among historians of the Holocaust, and again, I'm a literary scholar, but among historians of the Holocaust, to think about the German conquest of Lebensraum in the East as a colonial project, right? This is, in fact, and it's, I think, explicitly so, a kind of colonization of land to the east of Germany, and to think about what some of the precedents for that might be, and to see that, that European colonialism offers a kind of, again, blueprint makes it sound too one to one, I suppose, but that certain ideas about the link between race and space and the need for Lebensraum emerge in an imperial era, in a colonial era.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to distinguish between the claim there were sort of ideological connections, just like the ones that we already mentioned. I mean, the way race and space is related.
Right.
I think the topography of terror, as Wolfgang Zofsky would call it, there's similarities there. So it's one thing to say there are elements, themes certain operational practices that may be radicalized in a certain way. So there's that, but it seems to be at the same time, I think, complicated to question the uniqueness to some extent, the complete rupture with civilization, as Dandina called it in the Historikerstreit. There is, as you well know, that there is a political instrumentalization of the idea of, oh no, this was precedented. This is not something special others did. There is a connection between, or there might be a connection. There isn't necessarily a connection, but there might be a connection between the search for precedences and the attempt to, to get rid of some of the sense of guilt or responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, of course, these things can be instrumentalized. And of course, a comparative perspective can serve to help evacuate responsibility. And we know that because we all know about the Historikerstreit of the 1980s, when the point, 1986, 87, right? When the point of people like Ernst Nolte in making a connection between the Holocaust and the Gulag, Hitlerism and Stalinism, etc., was really, it seems to me, not to make a good, important historical point, but really precisely to instrumentalize potential connections, potential comparisons in the interest of minimizing German responsibility. I mean, I agree with that. I agree with that entirely, that that's always a potential. But I guess I'm also worried about the opposite possibility.
Exactly, it works both ways. Absolutely.
Yeah, which is that singularity can also be instrumentalized. And I guess I don't think you'll find anything in my work that ever suggests that the Holocaust is identical with any other event. Whatever, be it the Armenian genocide, the Rwandan genocide, what happened in the Congo under King Leopold, right? I'm never making a case that different histories are identical. All histories have their specificities, and certainly the Holocaust does as well. But if we push that line that you are presenting there too far, and I know you're presenting it for the sake of argument, it seems like what happens, and I think this did happen with the Holocaust at a certain moment, is that it's taken out of history altogether, right? It becomes
sacralized as an event.
Sacralized, it becomes an event that can't be explained because we have decontextualized it, right, from the soil out of which it arose, I guess I would say. And I mean soil here pretty metaphorically, I'd like to think. But that it has to have precedents. It has to have preconditions. It didn't just come out of nowhere. Right?
No, I think it's important to say or to think about two potential difficulties. One is the one that you mentioned, that the Holocaust becomes so sacralized as a site of memorial culture that it becomes, I wouldn't say painless, but that it helps evade to really think about what it was. Right. And the other risk I think one wants to avoid is that it is that it works like like a shade that makes invisible the colonial past that in particular Germany hasn't come to terms with at all, that is really in the blind spot of public collective memory. It's embarrassing how much it's still avoided as a topic. And so, I think these are the two poles that your analysis tries to both avoid. And yet, I think what I want to ask is, if you think about the plurality of our societies, if you think about the different contexts in which we think or mourn experiences of the past, the question is, how much do we have to take into account in what kind of current atmosphere we're currently speaking? That is to say, we live currently in a time of a re-emergence of the radical right, not just at the fringes of society, but at the core center of democracy, sitting as the sitting in the Bundestag, and evidently their revisionist program fancies nothing more than to relativize the Holocaust, to use multidirectional memory, not for the purpose of empathy or solidarity or for the purpose of thinking about a colonial past, but for the purpose of negating guilt, of negating responsibility, of negating equality and dignity of every human being. So my question is, how do we negotiate the different contexts in which we have, different echoes of violence, and how do we address them?
Right. Yeah. I think it's in some ways the key question, at least, for the topic that we're talking about. I guess, what I came to see in thinking about the multidirectionality of memory is that comparative memory, relational memory is in some way inevitable. Again, I do think memory is structurally multidirectional. It's always going to be calling up multiple events every time memories are articulated. So then the question is, how do we distinguish and how do we try to work between the forms of comparison that are troubling in the way that you said, that are relativizing, that are mobilized for political purposes that are dangerous, or that we in any case feel we need to oppose, and forms of comparison and relationality that are in fact opening things up, that are plural and democratic, I suppose. And I think we always have to ask not just what is being compared and how it's being compared, but why it's being compared, right? In the interest of what is this comparison being made? And so that's one of the moves I made after finishing this book, when I was trying to reflect more on the concept of multidirectional memory, to be a little more careful about distinguishing between different modes of multidirectionality. And I kind of mapped...
So it's not neutral. It can be positive and negative, and it depends on, how do you call it? I mean, the political affect.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the phrase I use, is the political affect. So I ask, I kind of created a sort of map, a chart, where I say, on the one hand, we have an axis of comparison that moves between equation and differentiation. On the other hand, we have an axis of what I call political affect, which moves between competition and solidarity. And so you've got kind of four boxes there, right, where you combine differentiation, equation, solidarity, and competition. You get different configurations. And I think, to me at least, that's been useful in sorting out some of these sorts of troubling forms of memory and being able to understand, when is memory being mobilized in a comparative dimension in a productive and democratic way, and when is it actually being used to evade responsibility, to express resentments, to promote further violence, what have you. And for me, for me at least, the kind of privileged quadrant of this graph that I've created is what I call differentiated solidarity. which is to say that when we bring histories together, we bring them together recognizing their specificity and their differences, as well as their similarities. And we do that in the interest of a kind of solidarity of different groups of victims, right? And I think it's possible to do that. And I think, for example, Du Bois is a great example.
Yeah, Du Bois is a really great example. I would like to address the audience at this moment and say, if you have questions, please send them in the chat, and somebody will magically, give me these questions. But I have one more. I don't know, skepticism or doubt, is that you seem to suggest that, multiple memories or the conflict over memories in a certain society produces more memories and not less.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, is that really the case?
I really think it is. And I really think that's fundamental to this whole question.
I'm saying, I can say what I'm worried about is that if there is a conflict, if there is a public discussion, the risk is that those who have been marginalized all along will be marginalized in that discourse again, because they just have less, discursive power. They have less symbolic capital. They have less visibility within the media. It is clearly, it's who gets to speak, who gets to address one's memory. And I think for Black Germans, that's a very, very important question. So you seem to be optimistic that conflict of memories will bring about more discussion of all kinds of memories.
Right. I mean, I guess I do believe empirically that it's true, but I also believe that what you're getting at is extremely crucial, is extremely important, which is that it's not a level playing field. There are differences of power in all societies that are shaping who gets to speak and who gets heard, right? And this sort of thing. But what I've tried to suggest in the book is that while that is true, it's not sort of in the operations of memory itself that we find the problem, that memory is more capacious than people have imagined, right? What I write against in the book, what my notion of multidirectional memory is posed against, is the notion of the zero-sum game, right? And that's the idea that if you're talking about the Holocaust, that means you can't be talking about slavery or colonialism. And then on the other side, if you're talking about slavery or colonialism, you're somehow relativizing and marginalizing the Holocaust. And that was really contesting that logic was at the starting point for me in formulating the notion of multidirectionality. And what I find, and what I still would argue, is that in fact, when you have conflict, it is indeed producing more memories, right? It's not, we can, and I guess it sounds so banal in a way to say it, but I think we can remember more than one thing at once. Right. And I think that should be the starting point. And then we can think about how we create the framework, the democratic possibilities for people to enter into the discussion, right? I mean, I think that's where we are in a certain way. But I just make one more point. So I think in the German case, the emergence of the Holocaust as the central, crucial memory of the Federal Republic happens fairly late, right? It takes decades before it really, I think, sits in an uncontested way.
That's a rather generous way to put it. Rather late, yes.
Rather late, right. So no, but just bear with me for a moment. I mean, I think there are different ways of narrating this. There are certain grassroots things that happened in the 80s that are important. I think it's really in the post-unification period that it attains the status that it has now, right? And with the memorial in Berlin as a kind of marker of that, but in some ways just a symptom of these larger processes. It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, because this is not really I don't call myself a specialist in this area, but it seems to me that a lot of the discussions about the memory of colonialism in Germany have emerged precisely in this moment and against the fact that the Holocaust has been elevated to this particular position. So if you see what I mean, it's the articulation of the Holocaust at the center of German memory culture immediately or very soon after started to trigger a host of other questions about other kinds of memory, right? And so,
so you're saying that is the way in which sort of everyone to some extent profits from multi-directional memory. I have a question from the audience that actually is I think, fits this discussion that we're currently having. And that is, how can we square the juxtaposition of opening spaces of multi-directional memory and the often very particular aims of contemporary activism? That is, how to bring these two together.
Do you think you could elaborate a little bit more on what you think that what is being, I'm not sure I could get the juxtaposition.
Well, I think it depends on how you perceive contemporary activism, but from what I understand is, or how I understand the question is, that contemporary activism, I mean, often expresses and addresses the pain or the experience or the perspective of a particular group that, you know, that used to be negated or marginalized or ignored. And so there is a certain need, you know, to actually speak as such a group who's, you know, for these experiences, for these perspectives to be perceived and discussed at all. And I mean, that's how I interpret it. I hope I'm not messing this up. And that seems to be, you know, there's the question, how do you relate then to multidirectional memory if you've somehow, through processes of marginalization are forced to focus first of all on your own perspective?
Yeah, no, okay. I think that's a very important question, and I see the issue. I see the tension, I suppose, and I guess I do say in the book, for example, that I think, you know, I make a distinction between, you know, this earlier post-war period before there is a sense of the specificity of the Holocaust, and then what comes later, let's say roughly in the post-Eichmann era, when the Holocaust starts to become a kind of sacralized symbol of uniqueness. And I suggest that it was absolutely essential, and I think you could make the same argument about the 80s in Germany and Habermas's position in the Historiker strike. At a certain moment, it's absolutely essential to assert the specificity of a particular history, right? That in order for recognition to take place, in order for commemoration and working through of particular histories of violence to take place, there absolutely has to be a recognition of that history in its specificity. So I do think that's crucial. I guess, you know, again, I think maybe it's not even helpful, but for me, it's helpful just to realize that can take place alongside, again, the articulation of other memories, right? That we don't have to imagine that form of commemoration as taking place in an environment of scarcity, right? And I guess there's an example in Berlin where I've spent a fair amount of time in the last, you know, 20 years, but not unfortunately in the last few years. But there's a site I hope again, but there's a site in Berlin that I think is kind of interestingly illustrates this, it's the Mai-Ayim Ufer, right, in Kreuzberg, where, and I'm not going to get all the names right, so maybe you can help me, or it's not so essential, but it was initially named after somebody who was involved in the slave trade, right, the Brandenburg, in the 18th century slave trade. And there was this activist intervention, part of the larger street renaming intervention, to change the name of that street so that it stopped celebrating, let's say, someone involved in the slave trade. And it was successful, right? And named after, ultimately when it was renamed, named after this Black German poet and activist Mai-Ayim, as everybody knows, I'm sure. And I think then what you have at that site so you have the commemoration of a particularly important figure, right, who I think stands in there for a particular community in Germany, a Black German community that deserves recognition, and her life deserves commemoration. In doing that, as the activists made clear, and as the site itself, now illustrates, you didn't have to erase the colonial past, which is often the argument against these kinds of street renamings, because that colonial past is in fact commemorated now at the site, as well as the life of my aunt.
I mean, it's a beautiful example, because one should really say, I would say, part of what is beautiful about this renaming of the street is also the activists' work prior to actually succeeding in renaming. I mean, the educational effort of this grassroots movement of Black Germans who put so much passion and historical knowledge into it, that I think the process to renaming the street is part of the memorial, so to speak, and not just the name. And I think in that sense, there is this multidirectional dimension that I think you speak about, is in telling the story of who the original person actually was, what that story related to, and then hopefully trying to resignify the street name.
Right.
Could I? Yep. Sorry.
I have more to say about that example, but we can also go on. I mean,
one thing
I want to say
unless somebody pulls the plug here, I'm happy to continue.
I'll try to be quick, but so, I mean, what you just described about the process of that lay behind the memorialization, and it's important, it reminded me so much of what James Young has said about commemoration in the context of the Holocaust, which is it's often the debates and the discussions that precede the actual building of a memorial, which are the most important, part of the story. So you have a similar argument that could be made in relation to the Holocaust and the debate, say, about the Berlin Memorial, for example. Mm-hmm. But to go back to my Ayim Ufer for just one more moment, there's yet another layer of memory there, right? Because that was also at the border there between East and West. And there are all these people who drowned in the river, including various migrant boys, because this was, of course, a neighborhood where there were a lot of guest workers had settled, and children of guest workers, and so there's yet another beyond the commemoration of my Ayim, which is essential, beyond the reminder of this colonial history of slavery that's also there. There's also a kind of small marker of those who drowned and died at this border. And so other histories start to be brought in. And that still remains, at least last I was there, and it's been a few years, a sort of marginal in relationship to the rest of the site, but it's there and it's marked. And so you really have layers of history and layers of memory in this one very small, site within one city in Berlin. So I think it's a nice example of how you can have particularity, but when you articulate that particularity, you realize that it's in a context that is multi-layered.
Now we already we're full into the discussion also of institutional politics of memory, and now the last example that we had was a beautiful one, because it really is a grassroots movement that it really is because of the activism of Black Germans initiative who made it possible to first of all think about these sites and then to change the names. Now I'm curious about how you would address the question of how helpful it is to have historic truth, or the understanding of a historic truth, protected by, institutionalized laws, by the state. Because the example we just had was a very different one. That was, a very democratic practice. Now, how helpful, how necessary, or how, Yeah, complicated are laws fixing a certain historic or protecting a certain historic truth.
Yeah, I mean, here we may have, you know, cultural differences, let's say between the US and Germany and maybe Europe more broadly. We have here, you know, such a strong kind of tradition of free speech as a value, First Amendment. And, you know, I think I grew up in that. It's part of me. I can't separate myself from that entirely. So to me, I have a kind of allergy to the notion that states can mandate history and mandate how we speak about certain events. That said, I also understand why in Germany there have been, and other places as well, there have
France
been,
is another example.
France is a complicated one again, but you know, in Germany, let's say to start with, and we can come to France, you know, why there has been very real legal limitations on what can be evoked and said and symbols that can be used, right, derived from the Nazi past. And I don't think that's wrong, right? You know, again, it's a little bit foreign from an American perspective, but I can also see why that was important to do in that context. But I think the French cases, you know, you start to see how you have a kind of proliferation of these different laws and et cetera. And I'm not sure that that's the level at which I think that we want to try to resolve these issues, I suppose. I find much more valuable these grassroots efforts than a kind of legislation from above, because I think it's in the grassroots efforts that you have a really living memory, you know. And I'm thinking, one of the things I have been thinking about is the connection between these contemporary grassroots efforts around the memory of colonialism, for example, and again, this 80s moment in Germany. My colleague Jenny Wustenberg has written a really important book about civil society and memory in Germany. It's been translated into German now as well, about precisely these sort of memorial site and history movements that emerged in the 1980s in Germany and really were the kind of, I think this was the driving force for what became this official public memory of the Holocaust.
I have to admit, I have to admit, I change my moral intuition every day on this question. Yeah. And it very much depends on, I think it very much depends on your trust in a public sphere that is able to negotiate and discuss and judge on what's true. Yeah. Now, I have to admit, in recent years, we've all come to unfortunately learn that the question of the distribution of knowledge or the distribution of truth, once it only depends on monopolies like Facebook and Google, is less secure and less trustworthy than I think I used to think about these questions. So I have to admit, I'm really, I'm ambivalent, I guess, about this. I have a number of questions from the audience. Can I shoot them at you?
Sure, let's try.
Okay, let's try. The first one is, God, I'm so glad you have to answer that. It's really difficult. It's a really difficult one, and I'm so happy somebody asked the questions. Is there also multidirectional forgetting? If we assume that a core element of crimes against humanity is trauma?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've been asked that question before. And I do think, and I will say, that I don't think in the book itself I had probably done adequate enough thinking about the importance of forgetting. And I do agree with many colleagues in memory studies, Alida Osman among others, that forgetting comes first in a certain sense. And memory is the exception and forgetting is the norm. And I do think that then, so what are the conditions that keep forgetting in place or enforce forgetting or lead to repression? I think they probably can be multi-directional, right? In other words, trying to think of a good concrete example. I mean, let's think about maybe early post-war early post-war period, the Cold War was, I think a lot of people would agree, a force that led to a certain amount of forgetting, or at least marginalization of the Holocaust, right? Because the interest became no longer opposing the Nazis, but integrating West Germany into the West. And as I'm thinking from the Western side here, but you could probably make a similar argument from the Eastern side as well, or a related one. You know, there wasn't as much of a, the enemy had changed. The enemy was now, from the Western perspective, the Soviet Union, and there wasn't as much sense in drawing attention to German crimes as there might have been. So that was a sort of one of the forces that led to a certain kind of forgetting. But that no doubt interacted with other ones as well, right? Within the German context, you know, various, I don't know, more intimate motivations for not grappling with what had just happened, the experience of suffering at the end of the war, which was real after all, or during the war. You know, I think that in any moment, in any context, national or international, there are certainly going to be multiple forces that are mobilized to, you know, at least kind of marginalize or push aside certain kinds of histories, and maybe to enhance the remembrance of other ones.
Mm-hmm. I have two last questions from the audience. The first one is, I have to translate, does the German memorial culture exclude non-whites, in particular by its institutionalized form of Erinnerungspolitik?
I do think that.
Sorry, there's another one that still belongs to that question. Sorry, I didn't see that.
Go ahead.
And how to deal with this without negating or erasing Habermas's position in the Historikerstreit.
Right, sure. Yeah, no, really important question. Certainly from my perspective, one of the most important questions for German memory culture. I do think that one of the problems with the singularity model as it has developed in the last couple of decades in Germany is that it reconfirms a certain kind of notion of ethnic or racial Germanness. And I don't think I'm the only one who has said this, but I've written an essay and have an ongoing project with Yasemin Yildiz, who's a scholar of migration and Turkish-German literature, among other things, multilingualism. And we describe this as the German paradox, that the way that German memory culture has evolved at a certain moment, it seems that it's necessary to hold on to a kind of ethnicized notion of Germanness in order to hold on to the responsibility for the Nazi past. And I think that's a problematic assumption. And I think it does, because I think it precisely excludes people, including Jews, right, as well as, let's say, post-migrants, Black Germans, etc., people who don't have a kind of familial connection back to, or ethnic connection, problematic as it is to even say that, back to the perpetrator society. And I think it's created a kind of what we call a migrant double bind in our work, in which on the one hand, you're told that in order to be German, you have to remember the Holocaust, but then at the same time, you're told, but that's not your history, therefore you can't remember that. And so you're in this impossible bind where to be German, you have to join in this culture. On the other hand, you're kind of constantly being pushed out of it and told this isn't really about you, right? This is us. And so that's one of the things that troubles me about the direction in which this notion of a German responsibility has gone.
Yeah, I think also the question of intersectionality evidently complicates it. Complicates this kind of historic reflection, you know, as a queer white German, sure. There's multiple references, and it you know, makes a, you know, a reasonable ethical relation, really complicated, I would say.
Yeah,
the last question I have is one that I think that you will like, because that is what you really care about, and that is, how could we get away from the idea that there's only a certain amount of memory?
Yeah. I mean, I do think this is, I mean, again, I don't know that this is just something we can voluntaristically transform, right? Say, okay, now we understand, now we believe, let's make everything okay, let's open everything up. But I guess I do believe, and in some reasons, this is why I've written the book, that we can think differently about these questions, and that in thinking differently about them, we can also start to act differently, right? And that we can start to create institutions that would support a more open way of thinking about the past. And I mean, again, I do think that a lot of these grassroots movements that we've been alluding to, and again, I'm not an expert, but from what I've seen, what I've observed, and what I know about them, I guess I've never seen anybody argue that we need to get rid of German responsibility for the Holocaust, right? From my perspective, what it looks like is people calling for an expansion of responsibility, right? And so to go back to a point you made earlier, we are in a dangerous moment, but for me, the danger is the rise of the right. And you see what's happening in Poland, you see what's happening in Hungary, you see what's happening with the AfD, you see what's happening in the United States and in the Republican Party and in the militia movements who just invaded the Capitol, right? I mean, this is a serious moment. And within that moment, you do in fact see an extreme amount of Holocaust relativization. But I think we have to be able to differentiate that kind of relativization from what people are calling for, say Black Germans or migrant Germans or Namibians or what have you. They're not saying let's put aside German responsibility for the Holocaust, which I think people on the right are in fact saying. They're saying let's supplement that, let's add to that. And again, that's what I hope my theory reveals is possible at the very least, right? Provides us a kind of framework for understanding that we don't have to give up the one in order to add the other. And if I could just refer also to your other point about being a queer white German and the question of intersectionality, this is really important to the work I've done since multidirectional memory as well. The book I published in 2019 called The Implicated Subject is about historical and political responsibility and how we're implicated in the past, even when we're not direct perpetrators, right? What do we inherit? How do we enable violence? And one of the concepts that I developed there is the notion of complex implication. Okay. And that's the idea that many of us, maybe most of us, have lines of connection both to histories of victimization and to histories of perpetration, right? So as a Jew, even though my family immigrated to the US before the Holocaust, we're not Holocaust survivors, but we have a link to Jewish cultures, which is very much there are histories of suffering and violence, obviously, that one inherits. But as a citizen of the United States, I am implicated in the violence that my country does in my name all the time and uses my tax dollars for. So I feel like many of us are complexly situated, but again, we can tease out those different elements and reflect on them critically, and we don't have to choose either or. So I think, and this is where I hope what I'm doing is I see in line with some of what you've done, Carolin, is it's against purity, it's against homogeneity, it's against simplification, and it's a call for a more complex understanding of these questions. And I think we need that complexity because we live in complex societies.
Yeah, thanks very, very much, Michael. I tremendously enjoyed this conversation. I thank the Bundeskulturstiftung for making this possible. I really hope we can bring you back to Berlin. Every now and then I thought he knows more about my city than myself. And I very, very much hope that we can continue to ask these questions, in particular in these trying times with, a rising radical right, with anti-Semitic racist dynamics. So I hope we continue this conversation, and I thank the Bundeskulturstiftung for making this possible tonight.
My thanks as well to you and to the Stiftung, and yes, I would love to be able to continue this and hopefully
come back. Thank you very, very much. Thanks everybody who's been watching and asking questions. And if you enjoyed this conversation, this is a series of the Bundeskulturstiftung. It's called Labore des Zusammenlebens, and there will be other discussions. And hopefully you'll be back then. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.
Bye, everybody.